Welcome back. You may remember that I told a really embarrassing story about making phone calls when I was in middle school and having unrequited love, mostly because I never managed to speak at all. If you've been paying attention to your debug window, it's been doing it, right? If you walk away and you leave the system alone, eventually you will experience a timeout. And as you see here, closed, reconnected, connected, data. And if we wait a whole 60 seconds without saying anything, the far end will hang up on us again. Like I said earlier, this is 100% expected behavior. In fact, this is exactly what you would want a TCP server to do. The thing for us to consider here is, what do we want to do with this particular state of affairs? Now, in the history of the AV industry, and really also in the history of inter-device communications, we've had a couple of different mental approaches to how to handle this particular situation. In the earliest days, all communication was done over serial ports. And it was, right, you were necessarily connected because you were physically wired. And that's part of why we have that half duplex, pass a carriage return, get a carriage return back kind of talk. When the network came to the AV industry way back in the day, back when I had more hair and less gray, the communication protocol came to TCP connections, and frankly, it was basically the same approach. It was, we just replaced a serial connection with a TCP connection, but it was effectively the same. We connected, we talked and passed the talking stick, the end of line character. They would talk back to us, passing the end of line character. And we used that in the industry for quite a while. Then somewhere in the middle, we sort of shifted our minds for a little while and said, you know what we ought to do? We ought to actually just disconnect whenever we don't need anything, right? So connect, exchange our information, get the information back, drop the connection. And we went through that time period for several years. I think the trend in the industry is actually sort of swinging back in this direction on this particular matter, while also simultaneously even just swinging away from this kind of communication anyway, right? The swinging away is moving into the land of asynchronous communication, of REST APIs and posting headers and getting responses and sorting JSONs. But there's still plenty in AV communications that are still very much like this. And in fact, we still have serial ports. And in some regards, sometimes serial ports are still the best, most rock-solid answer. But there are a variety of communication methods available to us, and we have this particular situation for us to deal with. Now, with all of that history up front, let's tackle the problem in what I think is the traditional way of, let's just keep that connection alive. Let's not let the connection get closed. Think about what would happen if we only were connected when we were interacting with it. It would mean that we would miss out on knowing that somebody turned on the lights from the wall panel and that the lights are now on. And our touch panel might still show that the lights are off because, well, we didn't tell the lights to change, so we don't know what's going on. I personally want my UCI to be up to date with the most relevant information as quickly as possible. I think that that's the best, and I think your client's going to agree. Now, in a previous module, you saw that we talked about the simple timer. We called it the timer.callAfter, or I called it the timer do later, okay? But that's because I said it in a Southern accent, but it is called a call after. There is actually a second kind of timer available to us in Q-SYS, and it has the advantage that the call after didn't have. Nate, do you remember what was one of the, I don't really want to call it a drawback, but one of the realities of using a call after was, do you recall? Do you remember?
Can't stop it.
You can't
Much
stop
like
it.
the beat.
You can't stop the beat. That's right. Because we've got it. And now I can't get that out of my head. Thanks. We have a different kind of timer. Timer.new will allow us to instantiate a named timer. It comes with an event handler. Basically, every time the timer goes ding, what do we want to do? We're going to define that in the event handler. We also have two methods. Remember, methods are denoted by the semicolons, and a method is basically a built-in function of that thing. Okay, so a built-in function of our name timer is that, well, you can start it. And it takes an argument of t for seconds. Because remember, all time in Q-SYS is reckoned in seconds. Lastly, there is also the stop method, which conveniently stops it. It just stops it, which is good because there are times where we want to start the timer and times where we want to stop the timer. This is good. So with this information, we are ready to go write some code. We want to start by giving our timer a name. We're going to create the name. I'm not going to complicate this. We're going to poll the level. If you wanted to call it a keep alive, you could do that too. It's functionally the same thing, but I'm going to name mine poll level. And I'm going to set it to be the output of timer.new, right? Basically, timer.new is a function that runs and its return is the timer that we're looking for, which we have named poll level. There we are. And so we need to write the event handler for every time that the timer goes ding. What do we want to do? Here it is, poll level dot event handler. Just as you imagined, it's a function. We're going to open and close that chunk of code. And what might we like to do? Well, give a little debug print. So print sent poll. That's fine. Also, we actually do need to do the poll. How do we do the poll? We're going to write to the dev lights. So dev lights, we're going to write. What are we going to write? We are going to write the string getlbl \r. And with that, we then have some decisions to make. One of the decisions we need to make is when to start the poll. So Nate, when do you think we should start the poll? Or maybe more so, when should we not start the poll?
Well, I mean, it sounds like you're making this analogy where you're like asking the girl, hey, you want to talk yet? Hey, do you want to talk yet? Hey, do you want to talk yet? So you should not be polling that if the girl's not there at all. If you're like outside of her house throwing rocks at the window and she's not home, don't do that.
Here's what Nate's getting at. Think about what if we did this? What if we said poll level start and fine. We give it a 1 second on the clock. What if we put it right there in the main line of the script? Is that a great place to do it? Actually, as Nate was suggesting, no. There's actually a really good reason not to do this. Every one of us has built a system at some point, or you're building a system right now, and at some point you will deploy one of these systems into a building, right? That's the whole reason you're taking these trainings, is because you want to deploy these systems because you're going to get paid to make AV systems. But think about it. These things go into buildings. These buildings run on electricity, and at some point, you're going to lose power. And then the power is going to come back, and then everything is going to start turning back on. So think about it. Your core is going to turn back on, and it's actually a Linux computer. It runs pretty quick. It comes back really quickly. And if you've ever stood in one of the closets when power comes back on, right, you know that it is a race between what comes back up next. the network or the amps. Because both of those things just take time to turn back on. So think about this sequence of events, right? Power is restored. The core turns back on relatively quickly. And as soon as the core is on, the control engine turns on. And as soon as the control engine turns on, the script starts. And as soon as our script starts, our script now is going, hey, 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 what's your level? Hey, what's your level? And the network switch isn't even on yet. So, Nate, where would be a better place to ask this question?
I would say that when we're connected.
Totally, right? And I'm going to make a little note here since you saw me do it on screen. We don't want to do this here. We don't. Don't do it in the main line. Instead, I like Nate's idea. We should start the poll right up here. We should start the poll when we think we're connected, right? If the TCP socket says, hey, I called, they answered, now is a good time for us to start talking. That's a great place to start the poll. Now, corresponding question, Nate. When should we stop the poll?
Well, boy, this feels like a trick question because clearly the answer's got to be when you disconnect. I feel like you're going to tell me I'm wrong.
No. When do we think that we are not connected?
When we get an error.
An error would definitely be a good time for us to say something like poll level, stop. Be sure to use the open and close parentheses. It is that method needs them to run. When else should we stop polling? Think about our example, right? I've picked up the phone, they've answered, right? If there was a connection issue, right? That would be a good time to stop the poll because something went wrong. When else? When else would be a good time to not be polling? How about if they hang up the phone? What is the event of them hanging up the phone?
Closed?
Closed. That is indeed them hanging up the phone. I'm also going to suggest that if there's a timeout, that's probably a good time to stop the poll because something weird happened and we got timed out, so we're not connected anymore. So, all right, one other out there. What other event is an appropriate occasion to stop polling because we are no longer connected? And this one is subtle because many of us see, oh, the socket was closed and think the socket is closed. Actually, what that event is telling us is that the socket is closed because the server hung up on us. When else does that connection get severed, Nate? What about up here in Func Established Connection? What's the first thing we do in Func Established Connection?
We hang up.
We hang up the phone, right? As the client, we are disconnecting the connection. So this also is a great place for us to stop the poll. So if you're keeping score at home, we have created, down here, we have created the polling timer. We have written the event handler. We have talked about when to start it, i.e. we should start it when we think we're connected, and then we should stop it every time we have good reason to believe that we are disconnected. And we could be disconnected because they hang up on us. There's some sort of trouble on the line, some error, some timeout happened, right? Something weird, right? Also, we could have hanged up the phone, and that would have been a good reason for us to stop polling. All right, let's do it. Hit save, and it broke.
Yeah, mine broke too.
Yeah.
You're trying to recall a timer before the timer exists.
Yeah, so let's read the note here. Mine says line 61, attempt to index a nil value global poll level. Well, let's look at line 61. Line 61. Line 61 is actually the very first time in our script that we are referencing poll level, and especially because it's a method that's trying to execute, Lua, as it's running down the list, gets hung up. And it's like, I don't know what you're talking about. I literally do not understand the words coming out of your mouth, Mr. Script. You're telling me to do something with poll level, and I don't know what it is. Many of us are not computer scientists. But somehow, some way, we all have received this fundamental knowledge of computer science of thou shalt not call a function before you define a function. Right? We all sort of intuitively know that, and we don't even know where we learned it from. This is it in action. We are asking the code to do something, and we have not defined it yet. So how do we fix it?
Just move it to the top.
Yeah, let's just move it up. And in fact, the only thing you really have to move is this poll level equals timer.new. Move it all the way up to anywhere north of line 61. I'm going to suggest that we put it right here underneath our declaration of dev lights. And so in fact, remember one of the things that I said over and over in this class was that we were writing this code basically very linearly. We have not reorganized the code and really put things in their places, which is like, putting variables and constants at the top, then your functions, then your event handlers. That really is a thing that you probably ought to do. But recall, for educational purposes, we've written it linearly. And especially, we wrote it linearly here to particularly precipitate out this error so that you could see it, so that you could learn how to debug your code, how to read what the error statements are, and understand what went wrong.
Hey, Jeff, I'm going to add one more thing to mine. So far, we've been sort of lucky that the client and server communication is infrequent enough that we really only get one response at a time, but I know that that's not always the case. So I'm going to add into mine, I'm going to prepare for our event handler to keep reading from the buffer until we know that that buffer is actually empty. I mean, normally if we get one message, we sort of assume that it's empty, but let's check again afterwards. We'll know that the buffer is empty if the readline method results in a nil return, right? So what I'm going to do is when we get our data event, as we've been doing, we'll do the read line just as we were before, but then we'll open up a while loop before we do our parsing. And so that after we get the first response, or after we parse that first response, we'll then do the read line again to see if there are any other responses in the buffer. And if the read line is not equal to nil, it has something, then it'll run that again. But if it is equal to nil, then that while loop ends. And that way we know for sure that we've definitely processed every single response that is coming in from the device.
So with that, I think we're actually done with the lights. We were able to tell them what to do. They were able to get real feedback coming back. We did a really cool trick with arrays and a lookup table, or a reverse table, if you rather think of it with that term. And now we have learned how to use name timers, which we can start and stop at appropriate times.
And we've also figured out the mystery of why you were never able to get the girl when you were younger, because you thought that the right thing was to just keep on bugging her, saying, well, do you want to date now? Do you want to date now? Every 30 seconds for fear that she would close your connection. And also because you had an end of line that you were reading from her buffer data, which means that you were really just waiting for your turn to speak rather than actually listening.
It was so hard being a teenager. I'm so glad I made it. But with that, we're gonna move on to the next episode. We'll see you real soon.